Bem-vindos todos à nossa sala. Vou apresentar o meu Job Market Paper aqui, vai ser em português mesmo. Vou tentar, não estou acostumado, mas acho que vale a pena falar em português.
Ô, Ricardo,
Oi.
Como eu disse, o padrão tem sido muita apresentação em inglês, tá? Então, se não está acostumado, eu acho que todo mundo pode acompanhar aqui, depende mais de você mesmo.
Então tá bom. All right, let's switch to English. This is my job market paper co-authored with Christiane Sherman from Princeton and prior to with FGV. It's called Development via Administrative Redistricting, Evidence from Brazil. And this will be a short presentation of 20 to 25 minutes. The motivation for the paper is that decentralization is in reform agendas worldwide for many decades across many countries. It has been subject to a long-standing debate in economics and political science about on different trade-offs, different benefits and costs of different setups. And just to be clear, here I mean decentralization through the creation of new units of splits with administrative, fiscal, and political autonomy. One reason that's relatively little explored in literature on decentralization for the splits is elite capture. Basically, periphery areas of the country can be neglected by the headquarters, by the town hall, by politicians in the urban center, which tend to control the government, urban elites. In this way, splits or redistricting would be a mechanism to redistribute autonomy and financial resources to where the returns are potentially the highest. However, this implies a type of equity efficiency trade-off. On the one hand, one may duplicate costs and require the construction of a new town hall, the hiring of new bureaucrats to repeat services in new municipalities, but it may reduce poverty and inequality across regions. To what extent a country values this substitution depends on what social welfare and what utility function the country has. In this paper, I'll take a step, one step simpler and ask the question, do administrative splits promote local development? And how, if they do? I'll argue that Brazil is a compelling setting to study this question for at least two reasons. There are more. One is that by law, municipalities have lots of administrative, fiscal, and political decision-making power, and a standardized horizontal structure, in the sense that regardless of whether a municipality has 20 million people or 5,000, all have basically the same rights and obligations constitutionally. And in the 90s, there was this rapid growth in the number of units during a specific window of opportunity between 1988, after the new constitution, and 1996, before a new constitutional amendment, which allowed for rapid growth in these number of units, which we can explore for identification in this paper. The main idea, the main identification strategy will be leveraging splitting decisions between places that apply to split to estimate a causal effect of a split on local development, public service delivery, and other aspects. And the identification strategy will be a diff and diff, comparing areas that split with areas that almost split. And I'll be clear in a minute about what I mean with almost splitting. So as a quick preview of the results, we first document that splits are initiated by small, rural, and remote districts within municipalities. This is descriptive at baseline. Second, we document that splits cause a substantial reallocation of federal transfers of FPM to these new municipalities. It causes a big growth in the public sector of these new units by hiring new bureaucrats, constructing buildings, etc. But relatively small effects on the local economy as measured by tax revenues, employment, and other measures. And some improvements in education and public services of about 6 to 14%, which we can, with Nightlight's data, show that is only driven by the new units, not by changes in the parents or the remaining parts of the municipality. In terms of mechanisms, we first find no mechanical effects driven from increased revenues, which in our setting is interesting. And we find that potentially what's explaining this is indeed the change in autonomy by allowing new municipalities to adjust their policy to administrative remoteness, to places that were farther away, and to local preferences of the electorate. So it seems to benefit the most places that were able to change the most their local policies. And in terms of aggregate effects, as I mentioned, we find no effects for parents and no effects for remaining parts of the municipality, which suggests no negative spillovers to the rest of the country, both in changing autonomy and changing resources. Okay, so I think everyone here is Brazilian, so I'll go fast over this, but a piece of institutional background. Brazil has 3 tiers of government: federal, state, and municipalities. Below municipalities, there are districts with no real decision-making power, and each municipality is composed of potentially more than one district. We have FPM as the main federal transfer scheme, which works in a zero-sum way within state. That means that federal government sends blocks of money to states, and within state, there's this fixed population-based formula on which money is allocated to municipalities. What happens is that first, this formula disproportionately benefits small municipalities per capita. And second, when a new municipality is created, all others weakly lose a bit because there is a reallocation across states, across municipalities, sorry. As you probably all know, 1988, a new constitution is approved, which famously led to the decentralization of powers to municipalities. And it also facilitated splits in a few ways. It gave states the responsibility to legislate over splits, and on average, it was all facilitated. So on average, districts only needed 5,000 people as a minimum to become a new municipality, and they only required a unilateral referendum vote. So the parent, the headquarters district, didn't need to agree on the split. What this caused was a 23% increase in number of municipalities in 2 waves, which looks like the graph on the right, which was relatively constant in number of units before, since the 70s, and grows quickly during this window of time. And by 1996, Congress passed this constitutional amendment that basically halted the process and that changed the requirements, made it harder, and required more legislation that was never really approved afterwards. Okay, so conceptualizing our empirical strategy, we build a control group with rejected and unapproved requests, which we call the almost split sample. The idea is that part of these requests are in fact denied by the local legislature or even denied in referenda, but also part of these are because districts applied too late. And if you apply by 1994, 1995, you simply had no time to go through the necessary bureaucratic steps to get your request approved. So it was left open by 1996 when everything stops. This gives us the opportunity to estimate 2 types of differences, one at the municipality level and one at the district level. So with this beautiful drawing of municipalities on the right, this is just as an example. Suppose there's one municipality that splits in the top and one municipality that almost splits in the bottom. In green would be the place that requests to split, that applies to split, and effectively does so and becomes a new municipality. And in the bottom, the applicant applies but is not approved, and we use that as a control group. So we can then either estimate a different diff at the municipality level, aggregating everyone here on top and everyone here on the bottom, and compare these two units, or estimate 3 types of different diffs at the district level. One for applicant versus applicant, remaining versus remaining, headquarters versus headquarters. Okay. So descriptively, we show that here in the column 1 versus column 5 as highlighted, but we can also discuss other columns. Applicant districts in our sample are much smaller than their headquarters counterparts. They have on average about 6,000 people versus 31, 32 for headquarters. They're much smaller in size. They're much less urban. They have less public services provided to them in the form of piped water, bit sanitation, a lot less on trash removal, and a few other things. This comes from mostly census data and nighttime luminosity data here in the bottom. So these are indeed places in the periphery of the municipality. Moving on to the empirical specification, this is a standard generalized diff and diff, where we will compare outcomes at the municipality or district level, including municipality fixed effects, state time fixed effects, characteristics at baseline, time fixed effects as well, to be very conservative and to saturate the regression as much as we can. And we'll be interested in these beta taus, which will measure the time dynamics of effects with leads and lags. And we'll be interested in looking at both of these groups of coefficients. And standard errors are clustered at the microregion level, and a few of these details if you're interested. And here I show the first main result is as expected given the institutional background, but it's good to check that when a split happens, a municipality gets a substantial and immediate shock in federal transfers per capita of about 30 log points, about 35% on average over time. This seems to be translated into investment and into hiring bureaucrats locally. So on the left-hand side, I'm plotting the log of capital expenditures at the municipality level, which, as we see, didn't change, wasn't significantly different before the split, but right after it spikes up and the pattern dies down over a few years, which is consistent with municipalities spending money on building infrastructure, building a new town hall, and getting a new municipality together. In the middle, it's current expenditures, which basically amounts to salaries and to costs of local bureaucracy, which also grows by about 12% in a less stark pattern, which also makes sense with the pattern of hiring, which takes longer and is more stable over time. And this is reflected also on the right-hand side on the number of public jobs from highs, which this is driven by jobs at the municipality level, not in federal or state level, and it follows basically the same pattern as the figure in the right. So municipalities seem to be growing their bureaucracy and their spending substantially. However, this doesn't seem to be converted into responses in the local economy and the private sector more broadly, as measured by the amount of local taxation on the left-hand side, but also using data from highs on the number of private jobs and the number of establishments more broadly. So it shows both in labor and in capital investments, if we take the number of establishments as a proxy for capital investments. It's marginally significant here, but the broader pattern I just state that the private sector isn't moving too much. So I want to detail one exercise on public service delivery, given for the interest of time, but just to have it discussed here. In terms of education, first, we would like to show direct provision of it. We would like to see the construction of new schools, for example, and show how that changes before and after a split. But unfortunately, there's no data for the early 90s on that measure in Brazil. So an alternative idea is to leverage exposure of children to investments in education being higher for younger kids at the time of a split. So the idea is to estimate a triple diff in this case, leveraging three types of variation. One is split versus almost split. The other is before and after the split. This would be a diff and diff, but we also leverage variation over age, over age groups before and after the split, and using three waves of census microdata, 1991, 2000, 2010. And here I thank DataZoom for making my life easier using that data. And the identification assumption is that absent a split, birth cohorts would have had the same education trends in split versus non-split municipalities. Okay. So not spending too much time on the specification in more details, but to give you the key results, we find that kids up to about 15 or 16 years old get a positive shock of 4 to 6%, 4 to 7% on school attendance. And this is not true for older kids, which makes sense with the fact that municipalities are directly responsible for the provision of education up to the 9th grade, which kind of hits exactly at 15 or 16 years old. And this isn't converted into literacy or a measure of quality too much, which is consistent with the story that facilitating the access to education, the attendance to schooling, is easier than improving quality, and perhaps quality takes more time to appear. This is one measure of quality that we are looking at. All right. In terms of mechanisms, the next question taken, so if we summarize the findings that the government grows, the private sector doesn't respond much, and there's some increase in public service delivery. In the paper, we have many others, by the way, but I'm just showing here the highlights. The next question is, what drives these changes in public service delivery, poverty there, which we also have results for? On the one hand, it could be a mechanical effect from increased transfers with a regional multiplier, with a fiscal multiplier. But it could also be other things. It could also be a different use of the same revenue. If now the median voter changed in these new municipalities and they're electing different people, they could be conditional on the same amount of revenues, be choosing different policies. It could also be something more, such as information aggregation changing, engagement with the local population and politicians growing. Maybe politicians change their level of effort and other things. I'm not really differentiating between 2A and 2B, but I try to tease out 1 versus 2 in the sense that, is this only driven by an increase in transfers, or is there something else going on? In the paper, we have exercises discussing that there's very little evidence for direct effect and a mechanical effect of increased revenues. If anything, we find evidence of a zero, that money doesn't seem to matter very much. And in the paper, we discuss 2 exercises on the second set of mechanisms, which I'll detail one of them right here. And the idea is to measure local preferences with referendum vote shares. The if referendum vote shares, which we collect data for in 2 states, Minas Gerais and São Paulo, if it proxies for reduced form, if it's a reduced form for differences in preferences and for perhaps neglect by the headquarters district to the periphery of the municipality, when a place is allowed to vote for splitting or not, this could reflect that. Places that vote the most to split in higher percentages, in 70, 80, 90% in the referendum, this is a good proxy for that. So the test we run here is asking if the effect of splitting on nighttime luminosity, which we can measure at the district level as a proxy for the provision of electricity or the growth in activity, if that is larger where places voted to split the most, when vote shares were the highest. And importantly, we'll control for the change in revenues to account for that explanation within the exercise. And what we find on the right-hand side is that in a diff and diff regression, where we interact the diff and diff coefficient with the vote share in the local referendum for São Paulo and Minas Gerais, places that voted the most to split in the highest quintiles, the third, the fourth, the fifth, indeed seem to benefit the most in terms of nighttime luminosity, at least. And we argue that this is consistent with classic views in the literature from Oates, Alesina, and Spolari, 1997, arguing that adjustments to heterogeneous preferences is one of the mechanisms through which decentralization and reforms like these can benefit the population. Okay, so to quickly conclude, I think I'll be 1 or 2 minutes before my time. In this paper, and as I said, there's a lot more in the paper which you can take a look if you're curious. We argue that this form of decentralization reduced poverty and regional inequality. However, we argue that this is a cautionary tale for decentralization and redistricting. There were some benefits in a few dimensions of public service delivery, but all this came at a pretty high cost of reallocating all the money to these new units and requiring lots of duplication of expenditure. We argue that this informs a broader literature on decentralization and the size of nations. It's really important to compare it to other contexts that went through similar events of administrative redistricting, like Indonesia, Uganda, and other countries studied in the literature. And we believe this provides a new counterpoint to the debate in Brazil, which so far argues that these new municipalities were only very inefficient and costly, but we are providing some evidence that there's a trade-off. There were some benefits, and it has its costs, and the debate now happens what is our preferences and what does the country value. But all right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Is there any question in the chat? I
didn't see it either.
Can you read it?
Let me take a look.
Do you have something to say about spatial equilibrium?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me address migration. So migration could be, the question is whether places that get independent could benefit from inflow of migration, and especially if migration is positive migration, if people are positively selected into new municipalities. We actually find very little evidence of migration. We find that first, population in total doesn't change much in these when a split happens at the municipality level. And using census microdata in 2000, that was the first to ask where was the person 5 years before in 1995, which allows us to at least compare the cross-section, places that split with places that almost split, what percentage of the population was living in a different place 5 years before. We actually find no differences between treatment and control here. So at least on that margin, we find no evidence of migration. And unfortunately, data on that is not much more detailed than what we have. So that's the extent of it. But so far, we find no large evidence of that.
Anyone else? So Ricardo, did you check directly productivity, aggregate productivity at the municipality level? Did you thought about it, or?
As measured by GDP per capita, by how would you measure that?
I don't know if you could get an idea from the aggregate PIA data. Of course, I mean, that would be a lot of work to get it at the firm level and do some, you know, to check if misallocation reduced or if you have any, because everything here is more like, it's not coming from the FPMA money, but it's more about what the mayor can do because he knows better the police or something like that. So I don't know if you check the satellite data, so I'm asking if you check the productivity itself.
That would be super cool. We haven't, though. It would be more effort to go to IBGE and get the firm surveys as one measure.
I think you can get something aggregate. I mean, not at the firm level, but aggregate, so some measure of capital, but I don't know.
Which will go back to the early 90s. That is the difficulty.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
But I'll take a look. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think most of the data is after 1996.
Okay. And
the quality is not as good as what we have today. Okay, so we are sharp in time, and just to let you know, we have a requirement in here to keep it in English. So let's do it. And Flavio. So thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you.
Flavio is the one presenting now.
Let me share. So in English, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we have to, I mean, if you really prefer in Portuguese, I think it's an option. But we have someone here like asking to keep it in English. And since it's going to be recorded, I think it's better for your research.
Yeah, no problem. I was prepared to present in English. Wait. Okay. Can you see my screen or not? Oops. Yeah, can you see it?
It looks frozen from here, the mouse. Maybe try to change the slide.
I changed it. So
no, not moving.
Not moving. Wait. Wait. And now?
Yeah.
Now it's it. Okay, perfect. So let me check the. So good morning, everyone. I'm Flavio. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in FGV EPGE. The aim of this paper that I'm going to present is to investigate empirically whether the quality of court enforcement affects the creditor's decision about requesting or not the bankruptcy of an insolvent debtor. It's a joint work, and the usual disclaimer when using the central bank, Brazilian central bank data, that the views expressed here doesn't express necessarily from the views of the central bank. So there are several empirical papers in the literature relating law in finance that have investigated the role of institutions for credit access, firm growth, and economic development. In particular, One of these institutions are the bankruptcy laws, which establish rules to resolve the insolvency of firms. So they contribute to reduce financial frictions by playing a crucial role in the protection of creditors, in the promotion of the reallocation of resources of distressed firms. One of these procedures prescribed by law in most of the countries, they prescribe this procedure is the liquidation, that a creditor, after some threshold of insolvent debt, a creditor can request in court the liquidation of a debtor. If no agreement is achieved and the liquidation is accepted, the firm is shut down and the assets are sold in the market by the court, and the creditors are paid following a priority rule established by law. So the threat of liquidation should act as an incentive for debtors to avoid default. But at each period facing a insolvent debtor, a creditor has the following trade-off, basically. Either he can request the liquidation, either roll over the debt expecting to be eventually repaid. And especially banks, they have some instruments for that, and I'll describe it later. But an important point is that the effectiveness of any law depends not only on the law itself, but also on the quality of the enforcement, of the court enforcement. Specifically in the case of a bankruptcy law, courts with a low level of enforcement tend to deteriorate creditors' expected recovery in a liquidation procedure. This because usually they tend to be inefficiently slow in the sale of the assets, decreasing the firm liquidation value that's obtained by the court to pay the creditors. This occurs mainly because of the depreciation of unsold and out of operation assets like machines and equipment. So given that low enforcement decreases creditors' expected recovery in liquidation of the firm, how does it affect his decision when facing a delinquent, insolvent debtor? So there is evidence in the literature of distortionary effects for the economy caused by low court enforcement. In particular, impacts negatively credit access. It also limits the contributions of a bankruptcy law for an economy. This evidence is suggested by the results from this paper of Ponticelli and Alencar, where they explore the bankruptcy law reform in Brazil in 2005 and find that the increase in total credit, investment, and firm growth after the reform was lower in judicial districts and municipalities where the courts were more congested. So they bring an evidence that the congestion deteriorating the benefits of this law reform. And so, but at the micro level, what types of distortions are created by low court enforcement? There is little empirical evidence on the mechanisms on how court enforcement impacts the outcomes of the bankruptcy procedures for the economy, and specifically, as we are going to analyze here, is the use of the procedures. So the main question is, does the quality of court enforcement affect the creditor's decision of requesting or not the liquidation of a defaulted debtor? For that, we exploit a new data set that we constructed on Brazilian bankruptcy requests from 2000 to 2015. In this version, we have only for the state of São Paulo. We are growing the data set. We exploit a high heterogeneity court congestion across judicial districts in the state of São Paulo. The fact that the bankruptcy requests, they are restricted to be filed in the district of the debtor's headquarters. It can't be in any judicial district, or where it's most of its operations. And we exploit an IV approach used in the paper of Ponticelli and Alencar to deal with endogeneity concerns. So a preview of results, we find some evidence that the banks are more passive and wait longer until deciding to request a liquidation of defaulted debtors in districts with more congested courts. With a simple theoretical framework that I will summarize later, we argue that a potential channel, it's a court congestion, deteriorates the creditors' liquidation payoffs, increasing the debtors' bargaining positions in renegotiations, and ultimately leading the creditors to postpone the decision about requesting liquidation. So it brings an evidence of one possible mechanisms on how low court enforcement affects the outcomes of a bankruptcy system. So it's an evidence that affects the use by the creditors of their legal protections. They would use it less when the enforcement is slow. Briefly, it's mostly related to the literature on law and finance, an incomplete contracting literature that studies a lot the role of the liquidation values on bargaining positions. And there is a specific literature on creditor passivity that I highlighted this paper that has a theoretical approach to describing the impact of liquidation values on banks' strategic decisions. And in particular, they found that the lower the liquidation values, the lower the number of bankruptcy requests made by a creditor. But an outline of the next steps, briefly the institutional setting, the summary of the theoretical framework, the data, and details on the empirical analysis. So in Brazil, our bankruptcy system, after the reform in 2005, is very similar to, in the law, it is very similar to the one in US. So there are two types of procedures: liquidation and reorganization. Liquidation is falência, reorganization, recuperação judicial. Liquidation is usually requested by a creditor. If accepted, the firm is liquidated and the assets are sold by the court, as I mentioned before, and creditors are paid following an absolute priority rule established by law. Usually the creditors with collateral first, and reorganization, as I said, this was introduced by the law reform. It's requested by the debtor in financial distress, and after he requests it, the firm submits a reorganization plan that the creditors will analyze and negotiate and vote if they accept or not. If they don't accept the majority, the firm is liquidated. So a liquidation procedure starts, and if it's rejected by the creditors. So as I mentioned before, at each period or each month facing an insolvent debtor, the creditor faces this trade-off: request liquidation or roll over the debt. By requesting the liquidation in court, they expect that the payoff is some fraction of the firm's liquidation value, that in our theoretical model, we see that can be deteriorated by the level of court congestion. And is for banks, by a regulation of central bank, they must have a provision of 100% of the total debt of this debtor. So not only the delinquent debt. So there is a huge impact on it's a provision for expected loss, and it increases the rule after a debtor is already delinquent. So it must increase the provisions. So it's a huge impact in the capitalization of the bank. The other option is to roll over the debt. It means that you gamble that the bank will gamble that the debtor will eventually repay, even maybe through a reorganization procedure. And they have they have they do some collection actions, calling or other protestos or other stuff, and renegotiations, trying to avoid, this is very common, try to avoid a provision of 100% of the total debt. So usually the type of renegotiations is with maturity extensions. So I will show quickly this table to summarize. So this is the rule for delinquent debtors. So after some delinquency days is increasing the amount of the total debt that the bank must keep for provision for the loss, expected loss of this debtor. So after 6 months, it's already 100%, is a lot. But if they renegotiate, they can stop deteriorating this rating. So it's the central bank allows to keep the worst rating after until the renegotiation. So if they were going to renegotiate here, the total debt can be rated by this. So it's a way, renegotiation is a way to avoid indefinitely increase in the provision. It's very common that the banks use it. Let's just a second to change the. So in the case of, so as I mentioned, it is increasing with the delinquency days. So it avoids to increase indefinitely the provisions. Is especially relevant for banks undercapitalized or during a financial crisis. And in the case of a bank, of a debtor requests reorganization, central bank recommends a provision of 30% and 100% in the case of liquidation. So the provision has strongest impacts on banks' capitalization. Renegotiations can stop to increase it. So these are relevant as well to choose between liquidation or rolling over the debt. So, and try to be faster here, but because we exploit the judiciary organization of, besides the law, the bankruptcy law being federal, the cases are filed in the state's justice courts, and each state has its territorial division into judicial districts or comarcas in Portuguese. And as I mentioned before, the bankruptcy is restricted to be filed in the judicial district of debtor's headquarters or moves of its operation. And just a few judicial districts have specialized bankruptcy courts. In the case of the state of São Paulo, just the municipality of São Paulo. And for those that do not have, the cases are filed in generic civil courts, and the judge assignment is rendered within a judicial district. I will be fast here, just try the summary of the simple static model. We try to, we open more in the paper if someone wants to take a look. So the creditor has the option to request a liquidation, and at any time t, any month, for example. So it will do it whenever this V is less than 0. So the expected recovery in liquidations is higher than expected recovery in continuation. And in the paper, we derive this conclusion. So the higher the court inefficiency or the congestion, the lower the liquidation payoff as deteriorating what the court gets with the sale of the asset. At any period of time, the higher the court inefficiency, the higher this V. So it means the lower it's equivalent, the lower the likelihood of requesting liquidation, because the expected recovery on continuation is higher. And we also derive implications over time. So we find that the higher the court inefficiency, the longer a creditor will wait until requesting liquidation. And it's important, I can explain in more a lot of details, but it's conditional to eventually requesting it. We consider in the model as well that there is a possibility that it will never be optimal to request liquidation. This will never exceed the continuation the continuation expected payoff. But in our data, we'll deal with only bankruptcy requests. So it's a case that we focus when the requests were made. So our primary data set, as I mentioned before, is the created data sets on bankruptcy requests. For now, it's just the state of São Paulo. And I will mention later, we already gathered for data on more 20 states, and we plan to expand the study for them. So it's around 4,000 liquidation requests from 2015. The information from a list of requests, we gathered the information in the website of the Tribunal de Justiça de São Paulo with firm name, judicial district, judge's decisions. We collect manually with the firm name, the CNPG. Also, I didn't mention here, but the claimant name, which is to see which one are banks. We also have the claimant name, and we collected the CNPG as well, either in HIS, but when we didn't find the HIS in Google or other sources. And we also computed years in court. That's one variable with the concluded liquidation case. So the other main sources is the SCR with credit register of the central bank. So it's monthly information of bank loans since January 2003. So it's the first limitation. Here we have, at the time, we had access only to bank history of bank credit, not other type of creditors. So we must restrict our analysis to banks. So there is the debt value, interest rate. So for each firm, we found all the history, and we identified when it defaulted some bank. So we have this number of firm bank observations with the full history. It's almost 2,000 different firms, an average of 4 banks per firm. But from those firms, only 98 firms of the sample had the request made by a bank. It's also documented in the literature. Banks are less frequent requesters, mostly because they have more, usually they are more capitalized, and they have the collection structure that I mentioned. So it's a very low number of observations that we are trying to expand, and I will discuss this in the end quickly. And the creditor passivity measure is just the time between the default and the bankruptcy request. So quickly, the HIS, we exploit just some controls of as number of employees, and the court congestion we build with the monthly productivity reports by court in the Justiça Aberta from CNJ. That's the number of pending cases over the number of judges. It's fixed in the year of 2009, but it's strongly correlated with the years in court for liquidation cases and other years of court congestion as well. So it just shows that it's very heterogeneous. I won't pay attention here in the summary statistics, but so the empirical approach is simple. I said it's conditional on requesting. So the passivity captures the dependent variable as I described. So it's the months between default and the liquidation request of firm I by the creditor J. So here it measures the backlog per judge of a judicial district, and some controls, some municipality controls, some firm bank controls like delinquent debt. And so our coefficient of interest is the beta that captures the effect of backlog per judge on passivity. So our main specifications, we restrict to the sample of only the firms that had the liquidation request by a bank. That's, as I mentioned, just 98 observations. And we use only the observation relative to that bank, that file. We also run additional specifications with the whole sample of all the firms that had the liquidation request requested by any creditor. It's the number that I mentioned before, but there is a type of sensory problems that, because the banks are not the requesters of the bankruptcy, except for those 98. And we have only the information at the time just of the default with banks, not with other creditors that we now have. So we don't know how long more they would have waited to request it if they would be eventually optimal to do so. So no clear the expected effect, and actually we don't find effects here. Endogeneity concerns. So the congestion level is not randomly assigned across the judicial districts. So there can be some bias from the universe on observables. The level of congestion can reflect the overall quality of local institutions, like can be a potential endogenous sorting of better firms to judicial districts with better institutions and less congested courts. And those firms might have more chances to overcome the financial distress, and banks can wait longer for them to pay and be more passive in less congested municipalities. So this would bias downwards estimates. So the higher the backlog per judge, the lower the time banks roll over the delinquent debt. They would wait less in high congested municipalities. Doing some analysis of correlation with some bankrupt firms' characteristics, here are some characteristics related to employment. So firms in judicial districts with less efficient courts usually have a lower average wage per worker, less bank branches. So yeah, maybe there's some indication they are less productive and less financially developed. So maybe a potential bias. And also using the credit data, their debt are lower. So maybe also an evidence of lower credit access. So we exploit an instrumental variable proposed by Botticelli and Alencar. I have to speed up a bit. So based on the division of the territory, judicial territory. So this division, the law establishes in each state minimum requirements to be eligible to become an independent judicial district. Some municipality characteristics like population, number of voters. So those municipalities that do not satisfy these requirements, the requests that come from them are assigned to one of the neighbors that are seat of a judicial district. So the potential recipients are courts of a neighboring judicial district. So the instrument that we build is called the potential access jurisdiction of a judicial district. The number of, for each judicial district, a seat of a judicial district, is a number of neighboring municipalities that do not meet the requirements. So that could potentially come to this judicial district and increase the workload of existing courts. In all specification, we control for total number of neighbors and average neighboring municipalities characteristics, but because they might be correlated, and for example, coastal municipalities, it's expected that they have an average less borders, so to control for this kind of stuff. And it is a good candidate for an instrument for backlog per judge. It strongly predicts court congestion and affects resolutions only via congestion. I have to speed up a bit, but so it's strongly correlated to both measures of court enforcement. The first stage to mention, this is in the full sample. There is an indication of a good instrument. In the restricted sample, with it's only not 95 because we lose some observations because of the explanatory variables. Besides, it is significant, but the f-stat of the first stage is not above the critical value. That we will explore more with more observations that we recently got from other states. But the correlations with other firm characteristics, after controlling for, that's important, the average neighboring municipality characteristics, it is uncorrelated with firm characteristics. Here with judicial district characteristics is in the opposite direction that it would be expected. I can discuss a lot of, with credit as well. There is no correlation anymore with this instrument. So we rely identification on also that it is not correlated to the bankrupt firm's characteristics. So, and it doesn't seem to be capturing another effect, as I discussed about this in the paper. So, as I mentioned, the main regression was only the few observations. So it's still, but we find some significant effect in a OLS regression, also in the IV approach, besides being not a strong instrument for this sample, and the reduced form as well. And so, as I mentioned, the additional results I'm not going to show, but with the full sample, not statistically significant effects. The first stage is above the critical value, as I mentioned, but not finding an effect actually makes sense for our argument in the theoretical model, because it's there are many types. There are banks that would never require liquidation. There are some that would maybe require it after a while, but we are started also to exploit an alternative outcome, that's probability of agreement after a request. We found reading identified judge decision, we built a data set with the decisions, and we found evidence of higher probability of agreement in more congested court. But the mechanisms are different than the described in this paper. We will explore more. So
Flavio, just a second. Yeah. So I think time is over. So if you wanna, okay, if you wanna jump to the conclusion, so you have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah. Okay. We are now expanding for more states to increase the observations, and we are also with recently structured data on original delinquent debt of all creditors from the documents of the case. We are going to exploit also debt renegotiation in SCR and these alternative outcomes as well. Sorry for going over the time. If there is any questions. Yeah.
If I can ask a question, well, I think it's a very interesting study, and show that the credit passivity problem is an important one. But at the same time, there are studies that show that well, this could go both ways, because sometimes you have creditors that have a liquidation bias, so they overly liquidate firms sometimes, and they reduce the size of the pie, which is a bad thing. So, for instance, I have a paper, the review of finance, that showed the creditors, when they have credit default swaps, they have a liquidation bias. So we showed that there was the change in law that actually facilitated renegotiations, actually increased the size of the pie. It was good for everyone. So my question is there a way you can explore in your data some heterogeneity to see whether for some cases actually is a good thing in terms of welfare, for some it's a bad thing, and also if it is the case that this is a good thing in terms of the fact that having credit facility problems is a bad thing. So firms could react to that and maybe borrow from multiple lenders in order to try to create some coordination problems. So increase liquidation in this case, so which would be good for the firms.
Yeah, this last point. Yeah, we have in mind this thing about coordination problems, and especially now that we have data, we are gathering data on other creditors. We want to try to explore this coordination problem. For now, it was just, as I mentioned, just with the main creditor or the one that requested. And before you mentioned some liquid heterogeneity within among banks, if they with the bias of the liquidation. Yeah, we'll try to explore bank fixed effect for now, and the controls also of the size of the debt, or that's some variables that we have to try to control for other stuff that could affect their decisions to decide for liquidation, and try to. So that's why I put a lot of credit variables of the size of the debt and firm size bank fixed effects as well, to try to capture some heterogeneity. But I will have this in mind to see, and we try to see some variation because of the congestion. So expecting that all the other stuff are controlled. But,
all right, anyone else? So I think, thank you, Flavio. Great paper, great work. So can I share my screen?
yes.
Host disable attendee screen sharing. So maybe, I don't know, because I was, so I think I'm not a co-host anymore. Is there anyone from SB? Okay, right now.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. I had to switch my account to solve the problem with my internet. So can you see?
Yep, we can see here.
All right, so let's see if it works.
Oh, yes.
So it's not working. Okay, now. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so would you mind if I present it like that? Because when I have it in the presentation mode, I can't see it anymore.
No problem for me. That's good.
Okay, let me
Yeah,
try
no
again.
problem. Yeah.
One more time. Okay, so now I think, so can you see the presentation?
Yes.
All right, so let me just make sure I have the time. Okay, so this paper is co-authored with Guilherme Baima, a student of mine here at the Federal University of Pernambuco. And it's going to be a little bit different from what we've seen today, because both Ricardo and Flavio were presenting empirical paper, applied paper. And our paper is more a cautionary tale for estimation of firm level production. We thought at the beginning for developing countries, but nowadays we think it as something bigger, like estimating productivity under endogenous distortions might be a problem. So just to make it clear what we mean by that, as a motivation, we remind you all that firm level data is widely available in both developing and developed countries. So it's been like that for the last 20 years. People are having access to firm level data, and it allows researchers, both in IO, industrial organization, or macro development, to go deeper on the studies of productivity, let's say. So among other things, of course, but so instead of just looking at the aggregate productivity or aggregate investment or aggregate production, you can go deeper and look at the firm level data, and sometimes the dynamics within firm and between firms is quite interesting, like to explain what is going on in these aggregate terms that we're looking for. So pretty much most of the literature on misallocation of resource or the pace of economic growth has moved to this more micro oriented situation, I would say. So other than that, so besides the fact that firm level data is widely available, we also know that estimates of firms' total factor productivities embeds countless studies in economics. So I was searching just before this presentation we just have like this would be a few of these papers published just in 2020 in top journals like Quarterly Journal of Economics, even JPE, American Economic Review, and others, is studying things like related to firm productivity, and at some point they have to estimate productivity at the firm level. So we know it's being around, the data is being around, we know the techniques evolved to estimate productivity at the firm level, and we know that people, we study a lot of things like the effect of financial friction on productivity, or anything like the rise of market power and macroeconomic implications, and then at some point you end up estimating a production function. So what we do in this paper is to illustrate some pitfalls related to production function estimation in the presence of endogenous distortions. Okay, so I like to think about this research that both Flavio and Ricardo, for instance, they could have thought about doing something in the productivity at the firm level, and they could estimate these kind of things for Brazilian firms. And I've seen some problems when applying these techniques for the micro data in Brazil. So we basically, just being a spoiler right now, we create this fake data set where we know there is a problem, and we're gonna estimate using the most used techniques and check how the buyers behave in the presence of these distortions. Okay, so pretty much what we got was that the well-documented sources of misallocation of resources. So there are some distortions in the economies that end up affecting the allocation of resources among firms, and as a consequence affects aggregate productivity. So what we're gonna say here is that the same source of misallocation, when you estimate productivity at the firm level, these sources are also, they have side effects on the estimation of total effective productivity at the firm level. Okay, so just to mention what I mean by the most used methods, I'm talking about these recent contributions that have been made on the estimation of production function, pretty much using what people call the proxy methods or the semi-parametric methods of Ole Paix, Levson, Petrin, Woodridge, Åkerberg, and most recently Gandhi, Navarro, and Rivers. Okay, so the main point of these techniques is to solve endogeneity issues such as simultaneity and selection when estimating productivity at the firm level. Okay, so the basic argument is that as an econometrician, we don't know what is the productivity, what is the firm productivity, but the manager does. So that would be the simultaneity problem. So when you estimating by OLS, you kind of assuming that the productivity, which is in the error term, is not affecting the capital decisions or labor or hiring decisions, but in fact, it is affecting because the manager has at least a good signal what is the firm productivity. And selection would be a problem because when we see entry and exit, when we see entry and exit in this firm level data, they're not random exit. Okay, so most of the time the exit is related to low productivity. So that also would be a selection problem. That to solve this problem, what most of these papers, they have their differences, but they rely on strong assumptions regarding investment decisions or input consumption. Okay, so they rely on a very, very strong assumption that whenever, I mean, to make it simple, the argument, when they see in their model, when they see more investment in a firm conditioned on a set of parameters, they believe that this manager is investing more because the firm has a higher productivity. So there is a monotonic relationship between productivity and investment that they rely on, which is quite dangerous. So they do test, just to make it clear, they do test robustness on the random shocks on interest rate or input prices. Okay, they do that, but the main model, they kind of assume everybody is under the same pricing set, either for interest rate or input prices, okay? So what they do in most of these papers, they introduce a random shock on interest rates, so they allow firms to face different interest rates, and they show that, of course, by doing that, you introduce some error in the productivity estimation, so it makes it more noisy, but it does not invalidate the estimation, okay? So, but why should we care? So we have a strong evidence that these sort of differences in interest rate, spread rate, or input price, these sort of differences, they're not random at all, okay? So they're not random. They're quite correlated to size, for instance. So size-dependent policies could make interest rate quite low for a set of firms and higher for another set of firms. So since it's not as random as the robustness checks are assuming to be, shouldn't we take a look carefully at the bias of the estimation? Okay, so that's pretty much what we do. So we know that there is a problem, but there is at the same time limited discussion on the performance of these methods under endogenous distortions. Okay, so we're gonna illustrate. So the whole thing here, the presentation, is gonna be about size-dependent policy, because that would be one of the possibilities in this world of endogenous distortions. Okay, so we're gonna say that small firms will have access to access to a subsidy or something like that. It's going to be cheaper for them to increase the capital, and but you could think about endogenous distortions as something more like broad, like a small firm that doesn't have a good signal for the bank, and then the bank doesn't know if the project is going to be good or not, so they have a very high spread on this guy. That would be an endogenous distortion as well. Okay, is there any question by now? No. So if you have any question, please interrupt me if you need. So what we're going to do, our strategy is going to be to simulate a firm level data following the literature. So Bizebreck and Achterberg 2015, where we generate a sample of heterogeneous firms in terms of TFP and initial capital. Okay, but then we transform this data into two samples, because when we simulate the TFP and initial capital data, after that we just leave the firms to be maximizing profit and choosing capital and labor afterwards. Okay, so they have these optimum decisions taken based on their TFP and initial capital. What we're gonna do is, like, for one group, we're gonna leave it free of distortion, and for the other group, we're gonna impose a size-dependent distortion. Okay, so we're gonna have two samples, but they are identical in terms of TFP and initial capital, but they have this difference that firms they make decisions differently because they have different setups in terms of distortions. Okay, so pretty much just this is more for who is not familiarized with who is not familiar with these techniques. But suppose you have this simple Cobb-Douglas production function and you log linearize it. So the TFP would be residual, and you do need these beta L and beta K to be well estimated. Even the beta zero here, you need it to be well estimated for you to uncover the productivity, which is in the error term. Okay, so you do need to get it as unbiased as possible, and that's what these techniques are. That's what they do. But the idea is that they proxy productivity with investment in most of the time in two-step estimations, assuming a strict monotonicity between conditional investment and productivity. So just for you to imagine, if you're estimating the TFP at the firm level using Brazilian data, and you're very close to one of the BNDES cutoffs, so you look at the left-hand side and you look at the right-hand side, and you get one firm which is very similar, one firm in the left-hand side which is very similar to the other on the right-hand side, but this guy has access to a subsidy in credit to buy anyway for long-term investment. And in the right-hand side, the guy which is pretty much the same is a little bit above the cutoff, so he's not eligible to get the subsidized credit. So when you estimate this productivity for these two guys, what these techniques will do is like they're gonna think that the guy in the left-hand side is more productive than the guy in the right-hand side, because condition on everything, he is investing more. And since I'm assuming this strict monotonicity between conditional investment and productivity, then that's a signal that this guy is more productive than the guy in the left-hand side is more productive than in the right-hand side. Okay, so that was the problem that we are trying to illustrate by imposing these distortions and checking how the model behaves. Okay, so I'll jump here for the data generation. How am I in time? The clock's not showing.
Yeah, about 10 minutes more in total.
10 minutes.
All right, thank you, Ricardo. So what we do, we simulate the data from a representative firm model, but as I said, you have this Monte Carlo simulation for TFP and initial capital, and afterwards you just leave this representative firm take these optimum decisions. Okay, so we follow the literature. Only capital is dynamic, so labor decisions are static decisions, taking period by period. Okay, and parameters in the initial distribution aim to represent a sample of firms from developing countries, just to make sure we are not dealing with a very weird data set. So, but that's not important. Okay, we could make like the same exercise with any distribution of capital and TFP, but we try to make it as close as possible to some data that we actually observe. And heterogeneity comes from, as I said, from firm productivity and initial capital, and profit maximizing decisions follow. So that's the profit maximizing decision for the firm for firms in these models. So each firm will maximize the net present value of profits over time, conditional on paying the salary for whoever they hire, and capital and pay some capital adjustment that we also follow the literature adjustment cost. Okay, so and capital just follows this law of motion that we see in almost every single model in macroeconomics and in microeconomics as well, and production function is a Cobb-Douglas. So we're gonna do for the adjustment cost as a convex cost function with this parameter b divided by 2 and investment square, just kind of following the literature. And then when we maximize, we have this sort of Euler equation in the model. And but what is important in here is that we have this expression for investment. Okay, so we make some assumptions in here that I don't think are really important about the log productivity as an auto-regressive process, and also these wages also following some distributions, just to again follow the literature on these sort of comparisons. Okay, so when we include a parameter, when we include the parameter phi to introduce some sort of distortion, what we are trying to do is to make this adjustment cost cheaper for a set of firms. That's what we want to do. And with this very simple model, the whole thing turns out to be quite simple, that whenever, so for instance, if a set of firms get this fee 1 bigger than fee 0, then they're going to invest more just by the same amount as the difference of fee 1 and fee 0. Okay, so things are very simple, but remember that investment decisions are conditional on productivity, and these are the things that we see here in the data, and that these investment decisions, since it's a dynamic problem, so they're going to be accumulating over time, and going to change we're going to change the it's not changing the period by period, but it has the potential to change the accumulation path for the whole setting. So we end up with this 1,000 firm worth 10,000 period under an exit rule applied only to six is applied only 635 firms survive until the end of period, summing up of 18,000 observation pretty much. And we impose this ad hoc as an example of fee 1 and fee 0, which is quite strong, but we're going to discuss it in the end. So we impose these distortions by the median, by using the median of initial capital is the median. So we get the initial capital and we split our sample in half. Okay, we have to impose an exogenous exit rule, but we also have endogenous exit rule, and measurement error are also included to make it estimated. Okay, so since I don't have much time, what we get is like from the sample. So this would be, so I think I didn't mention the reason for why it is why we need to simulate the data, is that in the simulated data we actually see the productivity. So if I go to the real data, I don't know what is the productivity, so I cannot compare what I get from the model to the real one. But here I can. So I know that the beta in the model is 0.6 and the beta K is 0.4. And when we estimate the model with these 4 techniques, which are the by far the most used techniques to estimate productivity at the firm level, they get, without distortion, they get very close to it. But then when we introduce the distortion, as I mentioned, then we start to get far from it. So we overestimate the beta for the labor coefficient, and we underestimate the capital coefficient. Okay, so depending on the capital share, since the productivity is residual, as we saw, depending on what's more important for the firm, which is depending on the capital share, we're gonna have the bias going in one direction or another. Okay, so here is the graph just to illustrate with these different distortions, that when we have a very strong distortion just like that, so treated firms, let's think like that. So these firms that got the subsidy, they invest 10 times more than other firms. So we would have this bias on TFP estimation that would underestimate the productivity for those with low capital share and overestimate with those with high capital share. Okay, so this is a sort of bias, but just to make it clear again, if we get the distribution of estimated productivity with the true productivity without distortion, since our model, since our data came from a well-behaved model, so the estimated productivity just get it quite right. Okay, so the distribution kind of overlap each other. But then when we start to introduce distortion, so we start getting far and far away from the actual distribution. Okay, and the bad thing about it, as we can see from the distribution, is that it affects dispersion measures. So sometimes these dispersion measures are used as a measure of misallocation of resource, or at least as some signal of that. And we see that distortion is underestimated exactly by something that could be causing misallocation of resource. Okay, so the good thing about it is that aggregate productivity was not really affected, but the covariance between productivity and output, which is also used as a measure of misallocation of resources between firms, is underestimated in this example. Okay, it could be overestimated in other samples, but we know there is a strong bias. Okay, we do that for difference in estimated and real productivity per capital decile, and we also see what we've seen before. So when you have no distortion, you don't have a systematic bias, but when you have the distortion, you do have a systematic bias. Okay, it doesn't change TFP growth at the firm level. So our feeling is that since we introduced the distortion at the beginning, and it remained up to the end in our data set. So whatever the model is getting wrong, it gets wrong for the whole time. So it affects the level estimation, but not the TFP growth. Okay. Okay. So, but still the correlation between the coefficient for situation with and without distortion is still high, but we do documenting here that we have this bias that we should be aware of. Okay, and since I'm sure that it's coming to some of you that the distortions are quite strong as a 5 or 10. We did it like we tried to follow the bias by different intensity of the distortion value. So when we do it, we change the distortion value and we get the bias. And so the bias we have this standard deviation here because we did it for different Monte Carlo simulations. So we're not getting something from a very specific data that we got from this Monte Carlo simulation. So if we do it with this distortion value that makes a firm to double investment, which could be reasonable, you start already seeing the bias on the labor coefficient and the capital coefficient. Okay, but it would appear.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to let you know that it's 10:01, so you may want to.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so and this is pretty much the case for all the other techniques, not only OLIPEX. So, so basically, the concluding remarks here are that estimating firm level TFP in the presence of endogenous distortions might be trickier than previously thought because we have this systematic bias. It's not a random shock that creates a random bias and goes to the error term. So it can actually affect the whole distribution as we saw. And we illustrated by a size-dependent policy, but we could think about it as something bigger than that. Yeah, so that's the message: to keep caution in policy conclusion from empirical studies using these recent approaches. So if you have the feeling that the economy that you're studying has a financial friction, is under severe financial friction, labor market friction, or any sort of distortion that might affect a group of firms rather than others, I would keep caution on using only one of these semi-parametric techniques. So the more you use, the better. And what we are doing right now is testing other type of distortions and simulating RCTs where, so I was talking about subsidized credit policy. So something that we're doing right now is like getting this data set up to the, I don't know, like, so let it run without distortion for 5 periods and then introduce an RCT that gives subsidized credit to a couple of, to a set of firms and see what the TFP estimation does. Because even if the productive doesn't change, it might be that the subsidy, we're gonna make it look like it did. Okay, that's it, guys. So Sorry about the timing.
Thank you. This is interesting.
Okay, so if we don't have any question, I think we are good to go. Thank you all for being here. Is there any question? Any to Flavio or Ricardo? No.
Not. I'll send you an email later. I think I have some thoughts I need to. I want to take a look at the paper too. But thanks.
All right.
Me too.
All right. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.